They moved in on a Friday, and by Monday, they'd begun to rewrite the story of my life. I read the message 3 times before the words sank in. "We're moving in Friday, my brother." The subject line sat there in my inbox like a stone, small, flat, impossible to ignore. It wasn't even polite. No, hi. No, hope you're well. Only the announcement, as if I were a property manager confirming a reservation. The sender was family. The tone was familiar. The presumption was not. There are moments when the past rearranges itself to fit the present, when a simple sentence pulls a string and a whole old sweater unravels. That message did that for me. I could see my mother's smile, my father's sigh, the way they always solved inconvenient things by moving someone else into the middle of them. I could hear my brother's laugh, the easy certainty that someone else will pick up the pieces. I felt, sharply and with little mercy, the tiredness that has been gathering behind my ribs for years. I live alone now, not by default, but by deliberate decision. After decades of doing the math between who needed what and when, I'd chosen a slower rhythm. My home is a small, honest place. Good light, a garden that's mine to weed, a kitchen I use for experiments rather than obligation. I keep my work schedule, my therapist, the friend who calls on Thursdays. Independence didn't appear all at once. It was built from tiny refusals, saying no to a holiday, keeping a Saturday for myself, refusing to carry someone else's groceries down the stairs because I was already dropping off my own messenger bag. Those little refusals are the kind of investments that compound. I started sleeping better. So the message landed like a test I hadn't agreed to take. Moving in Friday, immediate, logistical, intimate. The word moving carried other implications. They didn't mean staying a week or a weekend. They used the verb that suggests a new address, a new set of keys. They did not ask. They declared. It was an old family pattern dressed up as practical need. For a moment I imagined the scene, my brother at the threshold, bell in hand, talking as if he hadn't been the one to call last month from a motel room asking for a couch, or last year asking for a favor that morphed into a habit. I thought about the small rooms in our history where favors became expectations, and how, over time, my compliance had been cataloged as availability. I saw my parents' approving nods, the social shorthand among relatives that equates being useful with being loved. I felt, in that precise instant, the anger that usually simmers beneath politeness. And then I remembered the conversations I'd promised myself I'd keep, to speak plainly, to set boundaries that would stick. For years, I'd let kindness and guilt do the dangerous work of decision-making for me. I'd scheduled my life around other people's emergencies until my own plans were perpetually postponed. I had learned, slowly and the hard way, that generosity without limits becomes a map for other people's travels and erosion for the giver. Before I hit reply, I stood in my kitchen and watched the light move across the counter. I felt the small domestic certainties like armor, my keys on the bowl by the door, the tea kettle that whistles when I have decided the day is over, the stack of books by the chair that no one else was meant to touch. Those little things seemed suddenly worth defending. Not for the sake of the objects themselves, but because they marked the boundary between my life and the life other people assumed was theirs to claim. So I opened a new message and began carefully. I wasn't ready to be cruel, but I was done being convenient. That was the point when I realized this would not be a single sentence in a reply. It would turn into a year of accounts, of deciding who I would be to those who had always expected me to be everything. What felt like a domestic irritation at first was, I knew then, going to be a reckoning. I drove straight there, like a woman running late for a meeting that had already decided her life. The house stands squat on a corner lot, small in a way that makes it feel honest, clapboard painted a tired blue, a front porch that remembers better summers. I'd bought it knowing it wouldn't be grand. It was a clean break. It was mine. The lock on the front door had been replaced last spring after I finally stopped lending my spare key to people who treated it like a subscription service. When I pulled into the driveway, my brother's pickup was there, half-loaded with boxes and a mattress. He was moving with that particular sloppy efficiency he'd always had, coffee in one hand, a cigarette in the other. He'd quit twice, both times when the tide of family drama made him promise things he couldn't keep. My mother stood by the passenger door with a convinced smile, like she'd rehearsed her entrance. The neighbor's little dog barked, though nobody paid it any mind. For a second, the old reflex took over: smile, diffuse, direct the energy into placation. But I'd rehearsed this night in my head in 100 small, private ways, and none of those rehearsals included pretending surprise. I locked the car and walked up the steps with the kind of steadiness that comes from being older and having been lied to often enough that you learn to listen to what isn't said. "Hi," my mother said, as if we hadn't staged 1,000 interruptions around the dinner table for decades. "We didn't want to bother you, but this will only be for a little while." A little while had been the word that always mutated into the exact span of my patience. I looked at my brother. He looked like a man who'd been taught to expect his problems absorbed. I'd once been that person, too, absorbing. It takes practice to teach yourself to stop. "Mom, you called me. You told me they had nowhere else." I kept my voice flat, not because I wanted to be cold, but because anger with family is a performance that only ever gives them an opening. "When exactly were you planning to tell me? Friday morning? Friday afternoon?" She blinked as if she'd forgotten the logistics of emergencies, as if emergencies had an agreed-upon calendar. "We thought it would be easier if it was done before the weekend. You should have asked." The sentence landed like a small stone, but the ripples were already moving. I could feel my heart speed up, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of putting a boundary into language. Saying no out loud makes it harder to erode later. The boxes had already crossed the threshold. My brother had moved like a man expecting the welcome mat. I reacted like a woman who'd practiced protocols. I told him to stop moving things inside and that we were going to talk, properly, not in the half conversations of porches and old obligations. He rolled his eyes. My mother looked offended. The mattress slumped where it had been propped against the railing. I called the police. Not angrily, calmly, like scheduling an inspection. I explained that someone was moving into my property without my consent. The dispatcher asked for specifics. The questions were routine. The answers felt surgical. While I was on hold, I went to the cupboard where I kept a small notebook and pen. I started a list: names, times, what each person said. I photographed the truck, the mover's license plate, the boxes, practical things that resemble armor when you're used to being asked to prove your own boundaries. He told my brother to remove his things until we had a clear agreement. He advised my mother to come back with a plan that respected my rights. He wrote notes on his pad and gave me a card. I felt vindicated in a small, procedural way. But there's a cost to turning intimacy into paperwork. The face of the people you love becomes case files and witness statements. As the truck backed away and the mattress disappeared into the sunset, I stood on my porch and realized that calling the police would be the easiest part. The harder part would be accounting for every small favor I'd ever granted, for turning a lifetime of course, into an argument that could be lost in the soft currency of family memory. I had learned how to secure a property. I had not yet learned how to secure a family. They left as if nothing essential had changed, carrying boxes and old certainties. I stayed, writing down what they'd said, cataloging the fatigue and the relief in parallel columns. I felt competent and sad, the therapist's paradox. Competence kept the house safe. Sadness kept the house human. I locked the door twice, checked the windows, and went back to the notebook to make the list more detailed. Small practicalities. Change the locks, call the lawyer I'd kept in case of contracts gone sideways, tell my manager that something personal might require flexibility. Bigger things. The conversation I'd need to have with my sister, the one who always tried to be the diplomat. The emotional ledger was forming in front of me, line by line. When the porch light clicked on and the house sighed into evening, I knew this was not a single event. It was a protocol. It would require rules, witnesses, and hard choices. I had put my foot down. The question that hummed under that action was sharper: at what price would I remain the kind of person who could say no? They left the mattress on the curb. What they left inside was a list of expectations I now had to disprove. The morning after felt like a town meeting I hadn't consented to. Word spreads in families the way smoke follows wind. Someone called my sister. My neighbor's book club texted. My old college roommate left a voicemail that was part concern, part thinly disguised lecture. They all had the same rhythm, a three-beat of sympathy, suggestion, and an unspoken question. Didn't you know this would happen? I started the day with practicalities, changing the locks, confirming the lawyer's voicemail, answering an email from HR in measured sentences that hid the tremor in my hands. Then the calls came. My mother's voice sounded small on the line, flutters of apology sewn into rehearsed explanations. We thought it would only be temporary, she said, as if temporariness was a contract I had signed in invisible ink. My brother's texts alternated between entitled and plaintive. Just need a place to crash, one read. I'll pay another. Payment as a salve for habit. What surprised me and what hurt was the flood of opinion from people I'd known for decades. A neighbor I'd shoveled walks for in winter suggested maybe I'd been too harsh. A distant cousin sent a long message about family duty, with scripture sewn into the edges like ornamentation. The subtle accusation was always the same. If you were kinder, this wouldn't have happened. Kindness, in their telling, was a moral resource I had misallocated. Guilt, I realized, is an industry. It manufactures scenarios where your limits are the problem, not other people's entitlement. I'd lived most of my life in their factories, picking the packaged versions of myself, the good daughter, the reliable sister, because it felt safer than rocking the boat. Those identities get polished and displayed until they feel like the only acceptable coat to wear. And when you take that coat off, even for warmth's sake, people clutch at it like an heirloom. There's a particular cruelty in the way kindness compounds against women my age. We are the generation that learned to be both the professional and the unpaid domestic anchor. We learned to carry medical appointments, tax forms, PDA obligations, and emotional rescues in the same shopping bag. We became the default. When I started setting small boundaries, declining late-night calls that demanded immediate solutions, scheduling my own medical appointments, saying no to weekend caregiving, it felt radical enough to disturb family economies. At noon, I met with a friend from work for coffee. She listened without offering platitudes. You did the right thing, she said, and I believed her because she had also been the one to set a clear line with her own aging father last year. We traded stories, the ways our families weaponize history, how they use the memory of childhood favors to bind us into adult obligations. Talking to her made me feel less like a failure and more like a woman doing labor-intensive housekeeping on her own boundaries. Still, the social pressure didn't vanish. A post on a community forum, factual, but framed with a tone that invited judgment, raised questions about me. Why would I call authorities on family? One commenter called it cold. Someone else defended me, citing rights and property. Social media can't feel arguments the way the phone does. It substitutes moral verdicts for empathy. I watched the thread and felt my chest tighten, as if being seen by that many strangers were another kind of invasion. I slept poorly, dreams crowded with doors opening and closing. In the morning, a neighbor stopped by with a casserole and the question, "Are you okay?" She meant it. The question was a small act of kindness that required nothing in return. I answered with honesty for the first time since the mattress had arrived. "I'm scared and relieved," I said. Mostly, I'm tired of apologizing for being myself. That admission felt like the hinge of something. It didn't fix the paperwork or hush the callers, but it realigned the center of my life. For the first time since the message had landed in my inbox, I recognized that my obligations had always been elective. I could keep choosing them, but I could also not. The experiment of deciding began with the small, brave refusal to make myself available to anyone who assumed I always would. When you decide to stop pretending the problem is a one-off, the past suddenly looks like a file cabinet that's been left slightly ajar. I found myself pulling things out that I hadn't realized I'd kept, a string of old texts on my phone, a slew of unanswered emails, a calendar with appointments I'd canceled for other people. Memory is slippery until you start turning it into documents. It began with the little things. I opened an old notebook where I'd once kept thrift store receipts and grocery lists and discovered in the margins a line I'd written to myself one winter: "Don't lend keys again." I had jotted it after a string of weekends rearranged around someone else's needs. Seeing that sentence, written by my own hand, felt like finding a witness to my life, an honest, unblinking witness who had seen the pattern before I'd been brave enough to name it. Next, I went through my phone. There were messages from my brother that were casual on the surface and corrosive underneath. "Can I crash? Be there in an hour." You know how it is. Phrases like that are functionally vague. They beg for clarification but rarely offer it. Interspersed were other notes: my mother's reminders, my sister's attempts at diplomacy, my own responses that softened into acquiescence. The timeline showed repetition more than crisis. Small asks repeated until my identity folded itself around answering them. I printed them. Printing felt ceremonial, like translating emotion into something the world had to acknowledge. I labeled the pages, dated them, and made a folder that, absurdly, made me feel steadier. There is power in organization. There is power in making what was private into something legible. Then I reached out to an old neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who had watched our family for 30 years from across the hedge. She met me on her stoop with tea and something like resolve. "You always take on more," she said quietly. "I'll tell them what I remember." She gave me specifics: nights when my brother had stayed weeks at a time, my mother dropping off boxes and staying a weekend, my sister covering shifts at the clinic because someone needed a ride. Her recollection added weight because it wasn't filtered through our family mythology. It was observation. I also found a message from a previous landlord, written when I'd moved out of a small apartment a decade earlier. He'd noted, politely, that someone had been staying there longer than their stated visit, and that it had caused wear and tear he'd had to address. It was a mundane note, almost administrative, but it inserted pattern where I'd only felt frustration. Outside sources don't judge you the way family does. They just mark facts. Collecting evidence is not the same as healing. It meant reopening old hurts, the times I'd felt used, the holidays I'd missed, the promotions I'd postponed. Sitting with those memories was like walking through a house whose wallpaper had been lifted in places. You saw the raw plaster beneath. It smarted. It also clarified that what I'd been experiencing had structure and repetition, not randomness. There were surprising confirmations. A colleague remembered my brother being at my house the week an important client visited. Another friend had received a late-night request for cash during a project deadline. Each corroboration didn't erase the pain. It redistributed it from my private ledger to a broader account. I wasn't the only one who'd been inconvenienced by their habits. An unexpected ally appeared in the form of an old family friend who had worked in social services. She explained, in pragmatic terms, how dependency can be cyclical, how enabling, even when kind, trains people to expect rescue. She didn't shame me. She offered strategy: document, set dates, be consistent. Her voice was calm and sharp, and, for the first time since the mattress had been on my curb, I felt the shape of a plan. Pulling together evidence was both an act of self-respect and a reopening of old wounds. Each paper I filed felt like a stitch in a wound I'd finally decided to treat rather than ignore. I was surprised by how much relief there was in paperwork. Not the legal kind at first, but the human relief of seeing a pattern named and a strategy forming. It didn't make the guilt go away, and it didn't stop the late-night texts. But it made my case legible to myself and, eventually, to others. When the archive of my life began to tell the same story twice, I realized this was no accident. It was a blueprint. There's something strangely intimate about hiring a lawyer against your own family. You walk into an office with beige walls and the faint smell of toner, holding years of conversations reduced to screenshots and bullet points. You sit across from a stranger who listens not as a confidant, but as a witness to damage. It's a professional transaction, and yet, for me, it felt like confession. Her name was Amanda Rhodes, mid-40s, sharp eyes, calm voice. She listened without flinching as I told her about the "we're moving in Friday" message, the police call, the subtle shaming that followed. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she exhaled once and said, "You did the right thing." Then she leaned forward and asked for the details that mattered to the law: property ownership, prior agreements, documented communications, any proof of threats or coercion. Her questions were precise, not cruel, but every answer reopened a part of the story I'd tried to tidy away under civility. We spent an hour making a timeline. As she typed, the rhythm of her keyboard felt almost therapeutic, the chaos of my private life translated into orderly paragraphs. I watched her write pattern of repeated boundary violations and felt both vindicated and vaguely ashamed, as if I were tattling on my own bloodline. She noticed my hesitation and said gently, "People like to imagine the law only enters when love has left. But sometimes love needs witnesses." That line stayed with me. The paperwork came next. A formal notice of trespass, a letter advising them to refrain from attempting contact at my home, and a request for mediation before any further escalation. Amanda said we could file for a restraining order if things worsened, but she advised starting with documentation. "You don't need to prove you're right," she said. "You just need to prove what happened." There's a particular relief in being told that evidence, not emotion, will carry the weight. I signed forms with a steadier hand than I expected. Then came the administrative grind: notarizations, filing fees, courier receipts. Each task was small, repetitive, oddly grounding. I began to understand why bureaucracy survives everything. It gives pain structure. There was comfort in the exactness of form numbers and signatures. For once, my family's chaos was bound by margins. A week later, copies of the letter went out, one to my mother, one to my brother, one to their shared address, a short-term rental, which my lawyer found through public records. The letters were polite, legal, unambiguous. They requested that any future communication be conducted in writing and through counsel. Reading that line made my stomach twist. It's one thing to tell your family to stop dropping by. It's another to put it in a document stamped by the state. The backlash came quickly. My sister called first, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and accusation. "Did you really send them legal papers?" "They're devastated." I breathed before answering. "They moved into my house without asking." "That's not the point," she said, the way people do when they want to make guilt sound like reason. "It is the point," I replied, softly but firmly. The silence that followed was longer than I expected. After that, my mother sent a letter of her own, handwritten, shaky, with phrases underlined for emphasis. "Family doesn't need lawyers," she wrote. "We can solve this ourselves." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and slid it into the folder with the rest. Even paper can lie, but at least it lies consistently. At work, I found myself strangely focused. The office politics that used to drain me now seemed trivial compared to the logistics of legal defense. My supervisor, who'd heard fragments of the story, left a note on my desk: "Take care of what's yours. The rest can wait." It was the simplest kindness, and it made me tear up in the break room. By the end of that month, the house felt different, quieter, more deliberate. The air itself seemed to have agreed to stay within the lines. And yet, even as the paperwork settled into its folders, I knew this was only the beginning. Families, when cornered by accountability, don't surrender, they adapt. The next call, I suspected, wouldn't come from my brother or my mother. It would come from somewhere softer, someone still inside their orbit, armed with concern that sounded like love. And I would have to learn, again, the difference between help and infiltration. It's strange how private chaos bleeds into professional life, even when you think you've sealed the edges. For weeks, I told myself I could keep both worlds separate, home as a battleground, work as refuge. But guilt has a way of leaking. It seeps through tone, posture, unfinished sentences. My coworkers began to notice before I said a word. It started subtly. An anonymous email arrived in my work inbox with the subject line: "Unstable employee, potential HR issue." It mentioned family troubles and hostility toward relatives. There was no signature, but the phrasing, the passive-aggressive cadence, the melodramatic tone was unmistakably familiar. My brother had always used character assassination as self-defense. When people like him feel cornered, they tell stories that make you the villain simply for saying no. HR called me in the next day, following protocol. The manager, a man who liked to call meetings, chats, asked if everything was okay at home. I nodded, too quickly. He skimmed the email, frowning. "We're obligated to check in," he said gently. "It seems someone's trying to harm your reputation. Do you have any idea who it might be?" "I do," I said, because pretending ignorance has never protected anyone. I explained briefly, not the whole history, just the outline. Family dispute, boundaries crossed, legal action pending. I kept my tone factual, not apologetic. The HR manager looked relieved that I wasn't unraveling. Before I left, he said, "If this escalates, document everything." I almost laughed. Documentation had become my second language. At first, I feared being pitted. But something unexpected happened. People at work started treating me with quiet respect. A few had seen similar storms, divorces, manipulative relatives, messy estates. They recognized the exhaustion in my eyes. Instead of gossip, there was solidarity. One colleague, Julia, left a coffee on my desk with a note, "Boundaries are brave." I kept the note in my planner. Still, the family campaign didn't stop. They began calling my office line. Sometimes it was silence on the other end. Sometimes it was my mother's voice, soft and tearful, asking me to come to my senses. Once, she left a message that began as concern and ended as threat. "You're breaking this family, do you understand?" I forwarded the recording to Amanda, my lawyer. She replied with a one-line email, "Keep all audio evidence." "You're doing fine." But there's a loneliness to professionalism in the middle of personal war. I'd sit through meetings where colleagues debated budgets or design deadlines while my phone buzzed in my bag with texts from unknown numbers, traitor, ungrateful, UOS. The words hit like tiny stones. None of them could truly harm me anymore, but they reminded me that someone was spending time crafting them, which was its own form of violence. Around that time, Amanda suggested I extend my documentation to workplace interference. If they contact your employer, she said, that becomes harassment with intent to damage your livelihood. She spoke in calm, exact syllables. I started saving voicemails and noting every incident. The file grew thicker. It was exhausting, but also oddly empowering. The story was no longer fluid. It was fixed in ink and time-stamped logs. One afternoon, as I left a meeting, I caught sight of myself reflected in the office glass, shoulders straight, hair neat, expression calm. I realized I didn't look like someone under siege. I looked like someone surviving. That recognition carried me through the next week. But survival doesn't erase fatigue. At night, I'd come home to silence that rang like tinnitus. My home, once my sanctuary, now felt like a bunker. I kept the porch light on, the security app open, the curtains drawn. Sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of locks and keys, of doors opening onto rooms I didn't recognize. Then, unexpectedly, a small victory. HR confirmed they'd traced the anonymous email to an IP address linked to a public library 2 towns over, the same area where my brother was staying. They filed an internal report, added a note to my record marking me as target of external harassment, and blocked the sender. For the first time in months, I felt the scales tip slightly toward justice. The next morning, I woke up lighter. I made coffee without checking my phone. The world hadn't changed, but something in me had. The fear that I'd lose my professional reputation, the last clean thing I owned, began to dissolve. I realized that people respected transparency more than perfection, and that sometimes being honest about what you're enduring makes others quietly root for your survival. By the end of that month, the noise began to die down. My mother's calls stopped. My brother's threats dwindled to the occasional late-night silence. It wasn't reconciliation, it was retreat. The guilt machine had jammed, at least temporarily. At work, my supervisor invited me to lead a new project, a gesture of trust that made me both proud and uneasy. He said, "You've handled chaos with grace. We could use that." I smiled, not because I felt graceful, but because surviving without bitterness is its own kind of grace. I drove home that evening under a slow rain, the windshield blurring the streetlights into quiet halos. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was defending my life. I felt like I was living it again, inch by inch, form by form, breath by breath. There's a moment in every long conflict when you realize the story isn't just yours. For months, I'd been collecting evidence like a woman archiving her own sanity, emails, recordings, notes, every shred of proof that my memory hadn't exaggerated. But somewhere between fatigue and determination, the solitude of my battle began to dissolve. People started stepping forward quietly, unexpectedly, witnesses who had seen the same patterns long before I ever named them. It started with a phone call from Mrs. Alvarez, my old neighbor, who had already testified once in her own small way. "I remembered something," she said. "Years ago, when your brother stayed here after the flood, he took packages from your porch. Said you told him to. You didn't, did you?" Her voice carried no accusation, only gentle confirmation of what I already knew, that small acts of entitlement had always been mistaken for help. Then came an email from a former coworker of my brother's, someone I'd met only once at a family barbecue. She wrote that she'd seen the thread about me, the half-truths my family had begun sharing online, the distorted anecdotes, and that she wanted to set the record straight if it came to that. "He did the same thing at work," she said bluntly. "When people said no, he'd tell stories until they apologized." The kindness of strangers who owed me nothing was almost too much to take in. I added her message to the folder and labeled it "Outside Corroboration." The folder had grown into a small stack now, neatly clipped, a tangible counterweight to years of gaslighting. Amanda, my lawyer, encouraged me to start preparing affidavits. She spoke like a surgeon prepping for an operation, calm, efficient, unhurried. "You've done most of the work already," she said. "Now it's about showing the pattern." We met with a paralegal in her office, a young woman with an organized smile and a highlighter in every color. She helped me assemble timelines, cross-referencing events, messages, and witness accounts. The pile of paper in front of us stopped feeling like clutter and began to look like architecture. Each page fit into place. Each date confirmed another's accuracy. It was bureaucratic beauty, painful but precise. While we worked, Amanda said something that stayed with me. "People like your brother, your mother, they rely on emotional chaos because it's the only environment where facts dissolve. Once you move the fight to paper, they lose gravity." It was true. The moment I transferred emotion into evidence, the emotional blackmail lost some of its voltage. And then, something extraordinary happened. My cousin, the one who had always stayed silent, reached out. She said she'd been avoiding me out of fear of being exiled by the rest of the family. But she'd read the letters, seen the online posts, and decided enough was enough. "They did the same thing to Dad before he left," she confessed. "They made him think he was crazy for wanting distance. You're not wrong, you're just first." That sentence landed like a stone in a pond. You're just first. It reframed everything. I wasn't destroying a family. I was interrupting a cycle. We met in a cafe 2 towns away, neutral territory. She brought old photos and a copy of a letter my father had written to my mother decades earlier, a letter pleading for space, for fairness, for peace. It was eerie how familiar the language was, the same polite exhaustion, the same attempts to reason with people who mistook compliance for care. My cousin handed it to me and said, "You come from a long line of peacemakers who kept getting blamed for the fight." When I got home, I placed that letter in the folder with everything else. It didn't belong to this case legally, but emotionally it did. It was proof of inheritance, not money or land, but a legacy of misplaced responsibility. By then, the network of allies had grown. My therapist helped me rehearse boundaries. My neighbor across the street offered to be a witness if anyone approached the house again. Even my HR manager checked in, saying, "If you need character references, you've got them here." For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt surrounded by confidence instead of chaos. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was momentum. Every affidavit signed, every witness statement filed, was a small reclamation of the narrative. One night, as I organized the newest documents on my kitchen table, I caught myself smiling. The folders lay in tidy rows: property, police report, communication log, witnesses. The house, lit only by a single lamp, felt steady, not because the threat was gone, but because I was no longer alone inside it. That night I slept deeply, dreamlessly. When I woke in the quiet morning, I realized something I hadn't dared believe for months. The problem to be solved. I was the proof that it could stop here. Preparation, I learned, is its own kind of therapy. When your life has been rewritten by other people's narratives, getting ready to tell your version in a courtroom becomes something almost sacred. It isn't just about truth, it's about reclaiming coherence. Amanda called it the tightening phase. Every loose thread needed to be secured, witness statements notarized, documents paginated, exhibits numbered. The logistics had a rhythm: print, stamp, file, repeat, and it gave my restless hands something to do. But beneath the methodical calm, my nerves buzzed. I'd never been inside a courtroom for anything more serious than jury duty. The idea of facing my family there made my stomach turn. We held mock sessions in her office. Amanda played the judge. Her assistant acted as opposing counsel. My job was to sit upright, answer calmly, and keep emotion from spilling over the edges of professionalism. The first time, I failed spectacularly. When her assistant imitated my brother's tone, smug, dismissive, I snapped. My voice rose. My throat tightened. Amanda stopped me gently. "That's exactly what he'll want," she said. "He thrives on your reaction. Don't give it to him." The second time, I did better. I learned to breathe between questions, to ground my answers in fact, not feeling. I practiced phrases that sounded neutral but strong. "That's not accurate. I can refer to the documented record." I did not consent to that arrangement. Each repetition stripped a little more power from my fear. Outside of those sessions, I lived like an athlete training for endurance. Morning walks replaced insomnia. I stopped checking social media altogether. My world narrowed to essentials: work, therapy, preparation, sleep. Friends checked in, but I kept my circle small. The fewer distractions, the fewer cracks for anxiety to slip through. Therapy became less about grief and more about strategy. My therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen, taught me grounding exercises for the day of the hearing: how to plant both feet firmly, how to keep my gaze steady, how to answer questions without internalizing their tone. "You're not there to win an argument," she said. "You're there to describe a boundary. Let the law do the rest." Still, some nights I woke in a cold sweat, imagining my mother's eyes on me, not furious, but disappointed. That look had always undone me faster than shouting. I practiced facing it in the mirror, the way soldiers practice defusing weapons. I told myself disappointment was just another form of control. You can't win a war if you mistake guilt for peace. The week before the hearing, Amanda sent me a checklist. Bring 2 photo IDs. Dress professionally, neutrally. Speak only when addressed. Keep answers under 30 seconds. Trust the record. That last one, trust the record, was underlined twice. It became my mantra. Whenever doubt crept in, I repeated it. Trust the record. It reminded me that this wasn't about family perception anymore. It was about proof. Paper doesn't play favorites. 2 days before court, I went through the folders one last time. There it all was. The message that started it, the police report, the witness statements, the screenshots, the letter from my father that my cousin had given me. Each page was a small square of memory turned into evidence. Each mark on the paper was a reminder that I hadn't imagined any of it. That night, I did something impulsive. I drove to the house where I grew up, the one my parents had sold years ago. I parked outside for a few minutes, watching the porch light flicker on automatically. I remembered standing there as a child, waiting to be let in after curfew, rehearsing explanations for things that were never really my fault. The thought came unbidden. You don't live here anymore, not in place, not in pattern. Back home, I packed a small bag for court, documents, tissues, water bottle, mints, a notebook. It felt absurdly ceremonial, but ritual gives shape to fear. Before bed, I texted Amanda, "Thank you for helping me find my footing." She replied within minutes, "You built it yourself. I just showed you where to stand." The morning of the hearing was gray and quiet. I dressed in navy, not black, not white. Something steady. The mirror reflected a woman who looked composed, but I could feel the tremor just beneath the surface. Before leaving, I placed my palm flat on the front door, the same one my brother had tried to cross months before. It was solid, cool mine. And as I stepped outside into the early light, I realized that the courtroom wasn't the real test. It was just the proof of something I'd already learned, that peace isn't passive. It's built, document by document, breath by breath, until it stands enough to be defended. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, that institutional blend of order and unease. The security guard nodded as I passed through the metal detector, my folder pressed tight against my chest. The sound of the detector's soft beep felt louder than it should have. I kept repeating Amanda's words in my head. Trust the record. We were early. Amanda always arrived early. She said calmness was contagious if you got to the room before the chaos. She wore a charcoal suit, hair tied back, a presence that radiated quiet authority. She looked at me, then at the folder in my hands. "You ready?" "I think so," I said, though ready was a generous word. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Not cinematic, not grand, just four walls and a faint echo of footsteps. The judge, a woman in her 50s with deliberate eyes, presided with the weariness of someone who's seen too much human drama disguised as legal process. I liked her immediately for that. When my family entered, the air changed. My mother first, in a neatly pressed jacket, her lips drawn into a line that used to silence me at 15. Then my brother, sunglasses perched on his head like he was playing a role. He didn't look at me at first, just at Amanda, sizing her up as if she were an obstacle rather than counsel. When his eyes finally met mine, there was no guilt there, only disbelief, like I had broken some unspoken family code. The judge opened proceedings with the standard script: names, case number, purpose of the hearing. This is a civil matter regarding trespass, harassment, and property boundaries, she said evenly. Each party will have the opportunity to speak. Amanda spoke first. Her voice was a calm instrument. She presented the facts without embroidery: the text message announcing a move-in without consent, the police report, the pattern of uninvited entries, the digital harassment that followed. Each item was numbered, dated, cross-referenced. Watching her, I felt a strange dissociation, as if I were watching someone narrate my life in a language stripped of emotion. It was clean, factual, undeniable. Then it was my brother's turn. His attorney, a man too young to hide his nerves, tried to spin the story as a misunderstanding within family. My brother leaned forward in his chair, performing charm that didn't reach his eyes. "She's exaggerating," he said, with a smile meant for the judge but aimed at me. "We were just trying to help her. She's been distant lately." That word, distant, landed like a slap. It carried all the weight of years when my independence was treated as betrayal. I felt my jaw tighten, but Amanda's hand brushed my sleeve under the table, a silent reminder: stay grounded. Let the record speak. The judge glanced through the file, frowning slightly. "The documentation appears consistent," she said. "Ms. Rhodes, do you wish to add anything?" Amanda gestured for me to speak. I rose. My knees wobbled, but my voice did not. "I loved my family," I said simply. "But love doesn't cancel consent." I've spent years confusing the two. This isn't about resentment, it's about respect. I asked for space, and instead, they moved into it. The courtroom was silent for a full breath. My mother's eyes welled with tears, not remorse, but performance. My brother shook his head. The judge's gaze stayed on me, steady, evaluating. Then she nodded once, as if she'd heard that sentence before, many times in different forms. After a short recess, the judge returned with her ruling. The language was legal, procedural, and yet, to me, it sounded like liberation. The temporary restraining order was granted. The defendants were prohibited from entering my property or contacting me directly. Any communication had to go through legal counsel. Violations would result in escalation. My mother gasped quietly. My brother muttered something about betrayal, his voice rising until the bailiff told him to stop. I kept my eyes on the judge, memorizing the moment she said the words, "boundaries upheld." When it was over, Amanda gathered the papers with the efficiency of someone who's done this 100 times. She turned to me and said softly, "You did beautifully." Outside, the afternoon light felt sharper, like the world had been washed clean. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. I hadn't realized how heavy it was to carry justification as a daily habit. As we walked down the courthouse steps, my mother called after me. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she said. Her voice was small, rehearsed. I turned, met her eyes, and replied, then stopped doing it. Amanda opened the car door for me, and I slid in, exhausted but lighter. The courthouse behind us looked smaller now, not an arena, but a milestone. A place I'd passed through and survived. That night, I placed the stamped court order on my kitchen table and sat staring at it. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like oxygen. For the first time in years, my home was legally, officially mine. And in that quiet, legal, moral, emotional, I understood something that no judge could write into a ruling. Peace isn't the absence of family. It's the presence of self. The silence that followed the hearing wasn't clean. It was heavy, textured, full of echoes I didn't yet know how to interpret. For the first few mornings, I woke expecting my phone to buzz, another accusation, another guilt-laden message. But it stayed quiet. The quiet was both a gift and a test. Amanda called it the decompression phase. "It'll feel unnatural," she warned. "You've been living in defense mode. When there's finally no attack, your body won't believe it." She was right. My mind kept scanning for threats, rehearsing arguments that no longer needed to be said. It was like my nervous system hadn't received the memo that the war was over. I caught myself checking the locks twice, replaying the hearing in my head, wincing at imaginary criticisms. Then one morning, I realized I hadn't thought about my brother for hours. I was standing in the kitchen, making oatmeal, when it hit me, the mental space he'd occupied was finally empty. Not clean, not forgotten, but available. It felt like moving furniture out of a room and noticing how much light it actually gets. Still, the social consequences arrived soon after. Families, like small towns, don't stay neutral. The narrative spread I was cold, ungrateful, influenced by outsiders. My aunt sent a letter that began with "We all make mistakes" and ended with "You'll regret this when we're gone." I read it, then tore it neatly in half. There was no anger left, just fatigue. Friends divided quietly into camps. The ones who believed in boundaries stayed close. The ones who believed in loyalty at all costs drifted away. I didn't chase them. I'd spent too much of my life proving my goodness through endurance. This time, I let absence speak for itself. At work, things settled into something almost resembling normal. The HR manager nodded at me in the hallway with a kind of understated respect. My team treated me like someone who'd survived something significant, though we never spoke of it. I was invited to lead a mentorship program. The irony wasn't lost on me. Boundaries, it seemed, were transferable skills. Yet the house itself carried its own ghosts. For weeks, every creak of the floorboards startled me. I'd imagine footsteps, voices, arguments, the residue of intrusion. I started small rituals to reclaim the space. New curtains, a coat of paint, flowers in every room. I changed the locks again, not because I needed to, but because it felt like ceremony, sealing the past in brass and steel. Gradually, people who had witnessed the chaos began to check in. Mrs. Alvarez brought over her homemade empanadas and told me, "It's quieter now. The street feels different." My therapist congratulated me for finishing the legal process. "You've replaced reaction with structure," she said. "That's what healing looks like." But the strangest change came from within me. Without the constant firefight of justification, I began noticing small joys again. The sound of rain on the roof, the way light moved through the kitchen window in late afternoon, the fact that my laughter no longer sounded cautious. A few weeks later, I received a short email from my brother. The subject line read simply, "No hard feelings." The message itself was a masterpiece of deflection, no apology, only suggestion. "Maybe we can talk when things calm down. Mom misses you." I didn't respond. I forwarded it to Amanda for record keeping, then deleted it. The power in silence is underrated. Sometimes not replying is the loudest form of clarity. The months that followed felt like slow thawing. Winter melted into early spring, and with it came small signs of renewal. I planted herbs in the backyard, joined a yoga class, and started cooking dinners just for myself, not for company, not for performance, just for nourishment. I realized that the quiet was no longer oppressive. It was instructive. It asked questions I'd avoided for years. What do you want now that no one else is deciding for you? Who are you when no one needs rescuing? One evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, I caught the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's yard. I thought about my mother, about my brother, about the web of obligation that had once defined me. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry or guilty. I just felt separate. Peacefully, intentionally separate. The court order had given me distance, but distance had given me perspective. I could finally see the full shape of the relationship, not as love gone wrong, but as love built on expectation. And expectations, when unmet, crumble like paper left in rain. That night, before turning in, I took the legal documents, all of them, and placed them in a fireproof box in my closet. Not to forget, but to preserve. The evidence of what I'd endured was now history, not identity. For the first time, I slept without the porch light on. Healing, I discovered, isn't a straight line, it's a slow renovation. You keep finding old rot under fresh paint, small corners of the soul that still smell like smoke. The process doesn't ask for perfection, only patience. In the months after the hearing, I began to rebuild, not my reputation or my defense, but my rhythm. For the first time in decades, I wasn't managing anyone else's emergencies. My calendar was mine. My weekends were blank spaces instead of triage units. And the quiet that used to terrify me began to sound like possibility. Work became a sanctuary again, but this time it didn't consume me. I stopped volunteering for every project that needed saving. I learned to say no without explanation, and to my surprise, the world didn't collapse. Instead, I noticed that people respected the clarity. One afternoon, during a team meeting, my manager announced my promotion to project lead. I felt pride, yes, but mostly gratitude that I'd earned it without sacrificing myself on the altar of usefulness. With stability came the urge to create. I started painting again, small canvases at first, landscapes and still lives that mirrored the serenity I was chasing. The smell of turpentine and the scratch of the brush grounded me in a way therapy never quite could. My living room slowly filled with color, bold, unapologetic color. I realized that for years my life had been decorated in neutrals, as if I'd been afraid to take up too much visual space. One Saturday, I drove out to the coast, the first solo trip I'd taken in years. The road curved through hills like a conversation I'd missed. At the overlook, I stood with the wind on my face and thought, this is what it feels like to belong nowhere but here. That realization didn't hurt. It healed. Of course, healing doesn't mean absence of memory. There were still days when my phone vibrating made my pulse jump, when a voicemail notification triggered an old reflex to brace myself. But each time, the fear lasted shorter. The body learned safety in increments. Friends noticed the shift. Julia, the colleague who had once left me that note, "Boundaries are brave," invited me to speak at a women's leadership panel. The topic, saying no without losing yourself. I hesitated. Public storytelling felt risky. But then I remembered how many nights I'd wished someone had told me that survival doesn't require explanation. So I agreed. On the day of the event, I stood on a small stage under warm lights, facing a room full of women my age and older, executives, mothers, caretakers, quiet rebels. I told them what I had learned the hard way, that guilt is not love, that peace is not weakness, that choosing yourself isn't selfishness, it's stewardship. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with that soft, affirming applause that feels like collective exhale. I smiled through tears I hadn't planned to shed. After the talk, a woman in her 50s approached me. "You just told my story," she said quietly. "I left my sister's house last year. It took me 40 years to do it." She pressed my hand, and I realized the quiet revolution that happens when women start naming the cost of being dependable. We aren't dramatic, we're simply done. At home, my life grew fuller in gentler ways. I hosted dinners again, not as obligations, but as gatherings. Friends filled the table with laughter and wine, and no one overstepped. Space felt balanced, earned. My house finally sounded like a home. I even reconnected with my cousin, the one who had given me our father's old letter. We started a small ritual of Sunday walks by the river. We talked about ancestry, therapy, the ways generational stories repeat until someone chooses to tell them differently. One afternoon, she said, "You didn't just break the cycle. You built a new path." Her words lingered. Because that was what rebuilding really was, not just replacing what was broken, but designing something that could hold the weight of who I was becoming. By late summer, I'd stopped counting days since the hearing. The court order was still in effect, but it no longer defined me. I had learned how to define myself, through art, through work, through stillness. One night, I sat on the porch under a clear sky. The jasmine was blooming again. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who apologized for breathing too loudly in rooms that didn't belong to her. I wanted to tell her that peace wasn't found in pleasing others. It was found in finally trusting herself. The wind shifted, cool and kind. Inside, a new painting waited unfinished, a doorway opening onto sunlight. For the first time, I wasn't painting escape. I was painting arrival. Peace, I learned, isn't a permanent state, it's a practice. It requires tending, like a garden that keeps inviting back old weeds in new disguises. The first tests of that peace didn't come as crises, but as whispers. Emails, messages, unexpected encounters. Each one asked the same quiet question: "Are you still the woman who says no?" It started in early autumn, a full year after the hearing. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. When I did, my mother's voice filled the line, softer, older, but still wielding that careful tone of emotional diplomacy. "I just wanted to hear your voice," she said. No arguments. No requests. She talked about her health, about the house she and my brother were renting, about how strange the holidays felt without me. I listened, polite but cautious. At the end, she said, "Maybe you could come for Thanksgiving? Just dinner, nothing more." The invitation sat between us like fragile glass. A year ago, I would have rushed to accept, hungry for reconciliation. Now, I understood the subtle price hidden inside: just dinner. Re-entry disguised as forgiveness. Obligation dressed as nostalgia. "I'm not ready," I said gently, "but I hope you have a peaceful holiday." There was a pause, a long one, and then a quiet sigh. "You always were so stubborn." I smiled. "Yes," I said, "and it saved me." That night, I sat in the quiet house and let the moment settle. Saying no longer filled me with guilt, only clarity. Growth doesn't mean closing the door forever. It means knowing when not to open it yet. A month later, my brother reached out. His email was short. Mom's not doing great. Thought you should know. It wasn't manipulative, just factual. I surprised myself by replying, "Thank you for telling me. I hope she's comfortable." That small exchange was the first sign that distance had changed us both. He didn't ask for money. I didn't offer. There was no rehashing of the past, just two adults acknowledging the existence of shared blood without demanding shared pain. The holidays passed quietly. I decorated a small tree, cooked for friends, and watched the neighborhood fill with light. For the first time, the season didn't carry the weight of performance. It felt almost ordinary, and in its ordinariness, sacred. Then, in January, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. The return address was my mother's. My stomach tightened as I opened it. "I've been thinking about the past year," it began. "I still don't understand all your choices, but I can see you needed to make them. I'm trying to let go of being right and focus on being kind. If you ever want to talk, I'll listen." I read it twice. The old me would have rushed to interpret it as victory, an apology, a reconciliation. But I'd learned that real peace doesn't rush. It waits to see if the words match the actions. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. For weeks, I didn't respond. I let time do its quiet work. Then one morning in February, I wrote back, "Thank you for your letter. I'm grateful you reached out. I'm still figuring out what a healthy connection could look like, but I'm open to trying slowly." I mailed it without expectation. Healing, I realized, isn't about rebuilding the old bridge. It's about learning whether the river still needs crossing. Spring came early that year. The jasmine bloomed before April, filling the porch with its familiar sweetness. I started painting again, not doorways or escapes this time, but gardens, open spaces, sunlight through leaves. I even began mentoring younger women at work, many of them balancing the same invisible burdens I once carried. "You can be kind without surrendering yourself," I told them. Saying it out loud helped me believe it even more deeply. Then one Sunday morning, as I watered the plants on my porch, a car pulled up. My mother stepped out. She looked smaller than I remembered. No preamble, no performance, just a hesitant smile. "I called first," she said. "You didn't answer, but I thought maybe it was okay to come by." I hesitated. The old instinct to please, to soothe, stirred, but it didn't take over. "Come in," I said. "For tea." Inside, we sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once stacked evidence and cried over betrayals. Now, there were flowers on it instead. She looked around, quiet. "It's beautiful," she said. "Peaceful." "It is," I replied. We talked for half an hour, weather, health, nothing heavy. Before leaving, she said softly, "I'm proud of you. Even if I don't understand everything, I'm proud." After she left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, the cool air wrapping around me. There were no tears this time, just a gentle exhale, the kind that follows years of holding your breath. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't always arrive as a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just the moment you stop needing an apology to move on. That night, as dusk folded over the house, I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the windows, the things that had survived the storm with me. I felt a deep steadiness settle into my bones. Peace, at last, wasn't something I had to defend. It was something I lived in. And when I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I whispered a small, private truth into the darkness. I'm finally home. There's a quiet point in every recovery when the past stops feeling like a story you have to tell and starts feeling like a chapter you've already read. That's how it felt the morning I woke, without dread, without rehearsal, without the urge to defend myself to anyone. Just sunlight through the curtains, coffee brewing, a day that didn't demand apology. It's been 3 years since the message, "We're moving in Friday." I can still hear the tone of it sometimes, the casual ownership embedded in 6 small words. But it no longer stings. It's a relic, like an old photograph tucked in a box. I keep it only as a reminder of what it took to build the life that followed. The house has changed again. The walls are lighter, the rooms filled with small signs of joy, canvases leaning against the hallway, herbs drying in the kitchen, a faint scent of paint and basil. The space breathes differently now, not guarded, but open. When friends visit, they comment on the calm. One said, "It feels like you built this place around peace." I smiled. She didn't know how literal that was. Work became more than a job. It became a kind of ministry of boundaries. I mentor women navigating impossible balances, mothers, executives, caretakers. I tell them what I wish someone had told me. No is not a rejection. It's a direction. Some laugh, some cry, but most nod with the relief of recognition. The strength I once hid has become something I share freely, because strength, I've learned, multiplies when spoken aloud. My relationship with my family has settled into a new shape, smaller, honest, imperfect. My mother and I talk occasionally, in short calls that respect distance. There are no grand reconciliations, no sweeping forgiveness arcs. Just small moments of civility, sometimes even affection, rooted in truth rather than guilt. My brother stays mostly silent. I've stopped wishing that silence meant punishment. I choose to see it as space. The law eventually faded into paperwork stored in a fireproof box, still there but rarely touched. I keep it not as a shield, but as a record of clarity. Every signature on those pages was a sentence in the story of becoming, a testament that I once refused to disappear into someone else's comfort. Love, too, found me again, though quietly. Not the kind that demands proof, but the kind that sits beside you while you paint or cooks dinner just because it's Tuesday. A man who asks, not assumes. Who listens when I say I need time alone and doesn't take it personally. When I told him the short version of my story, he simply said, "I'm glad you stayed." Sometimes, in the evenings, I walk to the edge of the property and watch the sky darken over the hills. I think about the younger version of myself, the woman who mistook exhaustion for devotion, compliance for kindness, silence for peace. I don't resent her. She did what she had to do to survive. But I wish I could tell her this, that peace is not given by others, it's claimed. That self-respect is not loneliness. That starting over at 40-something isn't failure, it's mastery. Every now and then, I get an email from someone who read my article on boundaries and family estrangement. Strangers who saw their own reflections in my words. They tell me their stories, a daughter leaving home, a mother reclaiming time, a sister learning to stop fixing what never asked to be saved. I write back, always the same thing, you're not cruel. You're awake. I've stopped measuring my worth in forgiveness or in how many people stay. The ones who matter meet me where I am in honesty, not history. The rest can visit in memory, where they no longer have power to rearrange the furniture. Now, when the seasons turn, I mark the day not by what I've lost, but by what I no longer carry. The weight has become light enough to move freely again. On my desk sits one of my favorite paintings, a doorway opening onto a sunlit garden. I finished it the year after the hearing. For a long time, I thought it symbolized escape. But lately, when I look at it, I see something else entirely, a threshold crossed, a home reclaimed, a woman walking into her own life without needing permission. Because that's what this whole story was never really about losing family or winning a case. It was about learning that freedom doesn't mean walking away from love. It means walking toward yourself and trusting that love, the real kind, will find its way to meet you there. I close the window, the evening air cool against my skin. Somewhere down the street, a child laughs, a door closes, the world hums with ordinary life. I turn off the lights, brush my hand across the table, the same one where the first evidence once lay, and whisper to the room, to myself, to the woman I finally became. I'm here. I stayed. And this, right here, is mine.